I wrote on the board, if you can really decipher my handwriting, a thought by Abraham Heschel, which I want to put this as a kind of an epigraph to set the tone and situate ourselves in regards to Isaiah, because this is going to accompany our journey in this reading. Right? I'm going to read the text here. Right? It's a kind of a disturbing statement, and it is good. It has to be that way. Right? Otherwise, we are not with the prophets. Right? This is what he says. In biblical days, prophets were astir while the world was asleep. Today, the world is astir while church and synagogue are busy with trivialities. Well, we don't know what it means, don't know what he had in mind, but I feel that really this is appropriate. Right? And as far as Isaiah is concerned, that particular statement where we are confronted with a prophet who is supposed to disturb, to wake us up, that's really where Isaiah qualifies. This is really what characterized Isaiah when he was a prophet, and at that time, with regards to the people around him, the kings, the people of Israel, God's people. And this also qualifies today, when Isaiah speaks to us. And you will discover there. Let me just read the first verse. All right, we are going to start with the first verse of Isaiah, because this is the first verse which really situates the prophets. So we are going to read the verse 1 of Isaiah 1. I invite you to open your Bible. All right. The vision of Isaiah, the son of Amoz, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. All right, so this will be our program for today, this verse, all right? Because what we are going to see today is really to situate Isaiah in his context, right? To understand who Isaiah was. It's important to realize that Isaiah was really a flesh and blood person. He was in history. This is the way, by the way, the Bible functions. This is the way the biblical word is given. You start with flesh and blood. You don't start with a thought. You don't start with an idea. You don't start with an emotion. You start with the reality of history. You start with the roots on the earth. And once we realize that we are there in history, that the person who is talking is real, he's in flesh and blood, right? He exists, he has a body, he has a life. Once we realize that, then the word is going to be meaningful. Very often we have approached the Bible from the reverse perspective, being interested in the meaning, in the so-called truth, the wisdom, without too much, realizing the historical reality. And in Hebrew thinking, by the way, you start with the historical reality. You start with the body. You start with history. And it is out of that history that the word is articulated. In Western thinking, so-called Western thinking, which has been influenced by Descartes, Cartesian thinking. I think, therefore I am. Right? You heard about that, right? I think, therefore I am. The thinking, the message prevails over the reality of the one who gives the thinking. In biblical thinking, it's completely the reverse. I am. I exist, therefore I think. Right? I think it was, I was just reading the other day this particular statement of an Israeli essayist. He said, holy people has to be a living people. He was, of course, thinking at that time, he was defending the idea of, it was 19th century more or less, at the end of 19th century, defending the idea that the Jewish people had to have a land, they had to be existing. And so that was his point, right? A holy people has to be a living people. That's the same kind of thinking, right? So you cannot be holy without being alive, right? So this is why we start with a living Isaiah. And what we are reading right away, okay, is that he's the son of Amos, right? He doesn't come out from the sky like this, right? He exists because he has a genealogy. He has a father and he has a mother, right? He's the son of Amos. All right, that's the text. He's present in the city. He's present in the chronology. He's present in history. He's present in the world, right? By the way, when we say the son of Amos, do not confuse with the prophet Amos, who was more or less contemporary, right? You will see, 8th century also. But the church fathers, by the way, made that confusion, right? Church fathers made that confusion. They said, Amos, this is the prophet, and Isaiah is the son of that prophet. This is a completely different person. And as a matter of fact, in Jewish tradition, and I'm going to refer once in a while to Jewish tradition, because the Jewish tradition, when it comes to a few details, has been remembered. And it's very interesting because it gives suddenly a light which, is not always given. Jewish tradition is actually conveying a memory, all right, about legends, about the biography, right? So sometimes it can be it can be rewarding, can be interesting. And Jewish tradition, by the way, several Jewish traditions, that's quite significant. They are saying that as far as the father of Isaiah, he was the brother of the king, right? Amos was the brother of Amaziah, right? The king of Judah. If you read 2 Kings 14 verse 2, I'm going to write on the board a few things once in a while, right? Especially when it comes to references, okay? 2 Kings 14 verse 2, it talks about Amaziah. Right? The spelling when it comes to... could you give me the eraser here? Sorry. They spell it with a Z here in English. All right? If you read this text, it's talking about Amaziah, who was the king of Judah. So apparently, according to this tradition, Isaiah would have been the son of the brother of the king. In other words, the nephew of the king himself. Right? So that's kind of interesting because immediately it situates who Isaiah was. Right? He was a real person again. And then he was a prince, right? It's not for nothing that he was called the prince of prophets, okay, right? But he was also a prophet of princes, right? He was also talking to the prince. He had he could visit the court. He had free access to the court, the royal court. You can see him right in Isaiah 7 when he goes directly and speaks to the king. This is not just any person, right? He has a free access to the king, and he attends he knows the noble people, the nobility. He's an aristocrat, right? He belongs to aristocracy, and probably native of Jerusalem. If we consider the fact that he refers to Jerusalem several times, he knows Jerusalem very well, so he's probably a native of Jerusalem. He's a prince, okay, again, there is a statement, in a rabbinic statement, says, well, it's because Isaiah was the king's nephew that he used to chastise Israel. That because he was the king's nephew, so he felt free to say the truth, right? So he felt free to say things which were not pleasant. Well, of course, that adds to the fact that he was a prophet. It's not easy to be a prophet. But if you are the nephew of a king, well, it becomes easier, right? Because you can say the truth. If you're just a poor person, You're not going to listen to him. But if you are a prince, your word is going to be taken seriously. And as a matter of fact, unlike the other prophets, if you compare Isaiah with other prophets like Elijah, like Amos, all those prophets who were revolutionary, they were unpopular, they were persecuted, they were martyrs, they were not taken seriously. Remember the stories of Elijah, you remember the story even of Amos. Not unlike these other prophets, when you read Isaiah and you follow his story, his life, he doesn't come across as a revolutionary person. Right? He's well accepted. He is listened to. People even seek for advice from him, for counsel. This is very rare, right? Generally, prophets we don't like to listen to, but this one, yes, his word was, listened to. Okay, and by the way, so he was respected as a prophet. He had a wife, by the way, who was called prophetess. It's interesting. We don't have this elsewhere in the Bible. He is a prophet, and because he is a prophet, his wife is called prophetess. Not that she is herself prophetess, but she is taking the benefit of her husband being a prophet. All right, it's like, in some German countries. I know in Austria, when I was there, I was kind of impressed by this tradition. You have someone who is a doctor, right? A professor, doctor. The wife, she didn't study anything. We call her Frau Doctor, right? And the children sometimes Fraulein Doctor. She is just 3 years old, and she's called Fraulein Doctor because she is the daughter of the daughter of the doctor, right? So that's what we have here. So we have the prophetess, right? She is well accepted. This, the fact she is called the prophetess. That's the point. She's the family is well accepted as a special. Having received a special gift. This is the family of prophet. Even the sons, he has 2 sons who are also prophetic names, symbolic names. So they also function as prophets, you see. So this is really a prophet who is well accepted as prophet in the city of Israel. So among the nobles, among the aristocracy. So it's very unusual, when you look at when you see the prophets the way they are. Now, like the other prophets, however, although he was a part of aristocracy and nobility, he said things which were very unpleasant. Actually, he was also a revolutionary, and perhaps more revolutionary than the others. It's interesting. So he was an aristocrat, but at the same time, he was not afraid to, for instance, speak about justice, to defend the poor. One of the characteristics. We will have a moment in our study when we will really read those texts when he's really rash and he doesn't. He's not saying things which are pleasant to hear. We have. Actually, in chapter 1, verse 27, you can hear that, right? When he is talking about really those Zion shall be redeemed with justice. Talking about salvation here, right? Abstract concept, to be saved, right? Especially in some of Christian and other thinking, salvation. It seems to be something like a mystical experience, and that's it. You are saved. In Christian traditions, I am saved. That means that they have experienced a special encounter with God, a special religious experience. But he says, you are saved. This is what salvation, he said. This is the way he understands salvation. Zion shall be redeemed by justice. It's justice which brings. Justice is the condition for salvation, for redemption. This is a very strong statement. When you put this on the side with other words of Isaiah, this is kind of, so you can see that Isaiah is not just a dreamer. He is really a flesh and blood person who is wrestling with the historical reality and the historical iniquity at the same time. Okay, so this is what we have here. So he is really situated in history. And he is dated. Right? We have a reference to kings. 4 kings. Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. In the days of Uzziah. So he's not, this is not a, we're not going to talk about it's not a philosophical essay we are having here. This is someone who existed. He existed in the days of. And he gives names of kings who really had their stamp on history. He had relations with these kings, a certain rapport. I mean, the whole book of Isaiah could be read that way. The rapport, the connection he had, Isaiah, with the kings. If you just follow that connection, you will understand, you will realize who Isaiah was. And when we look at the name of those kings, we realize that, of course, it covers a special period of time from the, more or less the 8th century, the second half of 8th century, up to the first half of the 7th century. So you can situate that, second half, by the end of 8th century and the beginning of the 7th century, almost more than 70 years, actually. It starts in 740 BC, okay, and it goes to the end of Hezekiah, the destruction of Jerusalem, the fall of Jerusalem, and a little bit beyond that. That is 686, right? It's about, if you calculate, about 70 years, right, more or less, 70 years. More or less. So he was an old man when he disappeared from the scene. We'll talk about that later on. Right. For the moment, right, we are learning that he starts, with Uzziah, with then Jotham, and then Ahaz and Hezekiah. There is an interesting, I think, very significant connection between the prophet and the king. If you want to understand the complexity of that relationship, politics and prophecy, kinship and prophecy, melucha in Hebrew, and nevuah, right? This is the book where the Navi, the prophet, the word Navi means the prophet, right? You've heard about that. Navi. When I say nevuah, that means prophecy. Navi. This is the prophet. And then you have Melech. Melech, this is the king, right? Navi, Melech. This is the king. So you will have in this book the Navi, the prophet, professional prophet, and the king. And they always doesn't go very easily together, right? Politics and dreams. The prophet and the political person doesn't fit, but this is where we are. And actually, right, the prophet is going to intervene in the political life, in the historical life of the state. We have the story here about the war of Israel and Aram against Judah, against Ahaz. We will talk about that. For the moment, we just be exposed, great lines here to try to set up the background, historical background. So we see Isaiah being involved, being really a part of it, participate in all those historical events, the war of Israel, and when Israel and Aram once are threatening Judah, and he is right there in the middle. When Hezekiah is making an important religious reform, he is right there in the middle. He is involved. When we have the Assyrian invasions, he is right there. When we have the siege of Jerusalem, he is also there. So you can see all these events. He is there, and all these events have a decisive these are not just small events. These are very important events. We are really attending. We are really observing in these books in terms of the historical event of the biblical Israel, biblical history. So at all these decisive events in biblical history, Isaiah is there. He's involved. He has something to say, and he does something. He's very active. He is engaged, right? He is an engagé, as we use in our existential. He's not just a prophet who is just having his dreams and he's enjoying that kind of an ecstasy. No, he is on the scene. He is involved in politics, and he does say so. No prophet. I mean, if you compare Isaiah with other prophets, no prophet was so much involved in politics as Isaiah. So it's kind of an interesting prophet, right? He's not just talking about, dreams and making you think or trying to convert you. He is really doing things. Okay? He's not just a preacher. He's not just a dreamer. He is acting in history. No prophet was so much involved in politics as Isaiah. And when we say that, we have to take this totally. It means when you are involved in politics, when you are, you run risk. Right? He's not just preaching in his church when everyone is going to applaud and say amen, right? Or to a synagogue when everyone is going to enjoy that, right? He is in the street. And he is actually not only someone who is engaged, but he becomes sometimes the victim of that history. He is so much involved in that history that he is a part of that history. He begins tragically. Interesting. Let's look at the way he begins. We have a story which is indicated to us, and we have to read beyond the words sometimes, because this is the way the Bible speaks sometimes. It doesn't say everything. So we have to reconstruct what is behind on the basis of what the clues which the Bible, provides us. If you read chapter 6, and here you have the first king who is mentioned. In the year that King Uzziah died, well, I saw. Right. And if you read the text through, you will see that in that section, which is a very important and very dramatic section, this is one of those classic texts to which we will come back, where he talks about, he sees the vision of the Lord. It's interesting that he starts with seeing the God himself, and when one of the most important themes of Isaiah is the hidden face of God. Starts with he sees the face of God, and then his theme, which is recurring, we cannot see God, his face is hidden. But anyway, this is the first vision he's referring to, at least. And then he heard in verse 8, also I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send? And who will go for us? Then I said, Isaiah responds, here I am, send me. Right. The calling of Isaiah. This is what most Jewish and Christian scholars have concluded from this text. They are saying this is the beginning of the calling of Isaiah, when he was called as a prophet. In the year of the king, when the king Uzziah died. We have that date. We can really figure out that date. This is 740. I'm starting with that. 740. This is the date of the death of Isaiah. It's interesting that the first chapters, from chapter 1 to 5, no dates. We don't have any dating, right? So we don't know what happens, right? So some chapter 6 should be perhaps before chapter 1. We don't know, right? If you read some commentary, I mean the commentary of Goldingay, which I have recommended to you, he explains that the reason why we have chapter 6 here when actually it should be in chapter 1, because this is the story of his calling, right? So he should start with that. The reason why we don't have this in chapter 1, it's simply because Isaiah doesn't write chronologically, right? Isaiah is arranged logically rather than chronologically. This is what he says in his commentary. You will see that. Well, there is another scholar. I'm going to refer to him once in a while. That is an Israeli scholar who has studied the prophet Isaiah, and that is Yechezkel Kaufman. Oh, sorry. Right. Yechezkel Kaufman is, 20th century. He's no longer alive, but he was 20th century, early 20th century Hebrew University Jerusalem professor. And he's one of those who actually was taking the Hebrew scriptures very seriously. And he challenged, he was one of those who actually seriously and in many cases convincingly challenged the speculations of the critics of the 19th century. So for those who have a high view of scriptures, I think, and who take the scriptures seriously, I think this is an interesting address, right? You could go. And so he has written a book, by the way, it's a monument. It's several volumes, actually. It has been translated in English in a compact form, in a summary, and that is Toldot HaEmunah HaYisraelit. That is the history of the Israelite faith. And there in this book he is really addressing, all those biblical texts and biblical prophets, and trying to really confront the critical theories. He's one of those rare exegetes who supports the idea that the 5 chapters we are having here are really before, even chronologically before chapter 6. So I think it deserves our attention, right? And what he's saying here says, well, chapter 6 is not really the text of really the first calling. Isaiah had already been called before. But then he got into trouble, to problems. He was troubled himself. And I'm going to explain that in a minute. Therefore, he needed a recall. He needed to have an encouragement, because he was down, he was depressed, he was doubting, he had problems because of what he saw, because of what he experienced. And so, therefore, God realized that he needed to have another call, and this is what we have. It's not a first call, it's a renewal of an old call. What did Isaiah saw? What was his, in what way, he needed encouragement, he needed the stimulus? Because Isaiah had fallen from very high. He was completely disappointed. And in chapter 5, by the way, in chapter 5 we have the parable of the vineyard, right? The parable of the vineyard in verse 1 to 6, right? And in this parable already tells you a little bit of the frustration of Isaiah with regards to what was expected. When you give so much, right? And as a parent, as a teacher, as an educator, this is an experience as a pastor or as a rabbi. You give so much, and then you reap something completely different. You see, this kind of disappointment, of frustration, he's explaining in a humorous way, by the way, because it's so, when something is too heavy, you have to do it with a smile, otherwise it's unbearable, right? So this is what he's saying when you read chapter 5, and especially, he's describing the vineyard, this vineyard, how much it was a well-beloved, and everything was done for it, how God has, taken care of it, He has given everything. And then in verse 7, it says, and he looked, he was expecting for justice, but behold, oppression. For righteousness, but behold, weeping. You don't hear that, but in Hebrew it's much more, it's stronger than that, because he's playing on the words. So in Hebrew it says, he was expecting mishpat, and what did he get? Mispach. He was expecting tzedakah, and what did he get? Tzedakah. Right? So you hear that, you see? It sounds about the same, but it's different. You see, that's what iniquity is very often. It looks exactly almost the same as what he explained, but it's completely. Tzedakah means justice. Tzedakah means cries. Mishpat means also judgment. Mispach means oppression. You see, you hear the same thing. He's playing. He was expecting something, and something else happened. Great frustration of Isaiah, right? And in chapter 1, Israel, God's people, was well fed. Let me read that from the very beginning of chapter 1. He's describing how this Israel was well fed, this God's people, for Christian you could say, this church, this people was really, nourished, brought up, and what happened? What happened? What happened? He was well fed, well educated, and yet they rebelled. Yet they do not know. It's interesting, the word yada we have here. Yada, they don't know. It's not that they don't know the lesson. In Hebrew the word yada means recognizing. Means having a special relationship. We have the word yada, for instance, as you know, which is used to express the intimacy, the adventure of the conjugal relationship. This is the same word which is used. So God has done everything for these people. He has educated, He has well fed these people. And these people did not yada Him. They did not recognize. But He says, donkey recognizes the one who gives the food. The ox recognizes. He's taking really the worst animals, which are the dumbest animals perhaps. Just to look at the dumbest animals. He recognized the master. But here Israel has not. So it's so frustrating, so disappointing. And so he is depressed. Isaiah is depressed. And this is what we have here. Right? And he goes even so very far. You read in chapter 1, verse 9 and 10. He is comparing Israel to the worst it could be. It's like you are like Israel, the God's people is like Sodom and Gomorrah. He couldn't take a worse picture. You read that, right? He says, I hear the word of the Lord. You rulers of Sodom, give ear to the law of our God. You people of Gomorrah. I'm reading verse 14 of chapter 1. So he's comparing. This is what they've reached. In spite of all what God has done for them, here they are like Sodom and Gomorrah. I mean, this is unbelievable. And Isaiah is really receiving that. He is upset because of this. And he is really depressed because of that. And he keeps going, he keeps describing the situation of that people. And he says, look, in verse 11, they multiply the sacrifice, multitude of sacrifices. This is the way it is. When you are not following the right thing, what do? You become more religious. You hear the paradox here, right? You see, people who have a guilt, they don't respond to God, and to repair that guilt, what do they do? They become particularly zealous in religion. They multiply the sacrifices. Interesting, right? When religion is a cover-up, right? Multiplicity, activity, just to make sure that God is appeased. Kind of pagan way of thinking. So many sacrifices, so many things. I will do everything to please God, and so forth. But it's a cover-up. It's a cover-up for their iniquity, cover-up for their lack of really consistency. You see, this is what. So Also, he describes Israel who are concerned with appearance. I mean, you read in chapter 3, verse 16. I mean, it's a funny text, by the way. Chapter 3, verse 16. Many funny texts in the book of Isaiah, by the way. Isaiah is really someone. He's not just saying things which are harsh and which are profound. He's going to make us smile. And you will hear that it's a satire. He is describing a fashion procession. You call this a fashion procession, right? Fashion procession. Look at it. Look at here. I'm reading in verse 16. Because the daughters of Zion are haughty and walk with outstretched necks and wanton eyes, walking and mincing as they go, making a jingling with their feet. Therefore, the Lord will strike with the stab and so forth. So he's describing, look at how the people, they are concerned with their dressing, they are concerned with the appearance, they are with shallow things, right? And when in fact the essential is no longer there. So this is Israel. So we are talking about is a real failure. Failure. I remember when many years ago I was taking a class, and I need to refer to him as it is a tradition, actually in rabbinic tradition, when you convey something, you have to refer to your sources, right? And so I was sitting in a class on Isaiah when the topic was the theme of failure in the book of Isaiah. I was intrigued by this. I sat and looked at the whole thing. The theme of failure in the country. So the very important theme, motive. This is failure. Failed. Isaiah has failed. The people has failed. God has failed. And you know what happens is that there is an expression of this failure. There is a certain irony when you fail. You don't want to recognize that. And you read in Isaiah 5. Reading Isaiah 5 here. And verse 19 and 20. Where actually what's happening here, when you reach that stage, woe of those who call evil good and good evil. You know, that's the problem, finally. When you reach a stage in your condition that it is so bad that the only way for you to survive that condition is to turn it into something good. The iniquity is so iniquity, so the only way for you to survive is to say this iniquity is not iniquity, it's good actually. So this is what is happening. They've reached that place where suddenly everything is upside down, right? The good is evil, evil is good, and this is where we are. And the climax of this whole crisis I'm talking about, and this is where we are now. The climax of this whole crisis, on which I have, just touched a little bit, okay, is Uzziah. The death of Uzziah. It's not just any person, not just any death. Uzziah is a leper. And you need to realize that Uzziah is a leper, and he died as an outcast. He was buried in a special place for lepers, right? You have the story which is given in 2 Chronicles in chapter 26. We will not have time to go into all the details of this reading. I mean, at least in that study here, but you can read 2 Chronicles 26. Okay, I'm going to open the book. 2 Chronicles, the book of Chronicles, the book of Kings should accompany our reading, of course, of the book of Isaiah. 2 Chronicles, verse 4, 26, verse 16 to 33. But when he was strong, he's talking about Uzziah. Now we are starting with that, right? Isaiah begins with Uzziah. This is the way he begins. Uzziah, who was this Uzziah? He was a king. He was strong his heart. When he was strong in his heart, when he became, a good man, then his heart, when he was strong, his heart was lifted up to his destruction. And you know what happened? He did things, which were already terrible. I mean, he actually he wanted to confront God. He wanted to challenge God. I mean, actually, the text tells us that the king Uzziah wanted to burn the incense. He wanted to do things which were not according to the Torah, not according to the law, and he was really provoking God and taking actually God's place in a way. And the text tells us that there on his forehead he was leprous. King Uzziah was a leper. The text says in verse 21, until the day of his death, and he dwelt in an isolated house. And then Jotham, his son, was over the king's house, judging the people of the land. So this is where we are right now. See, so we are talking, and you know what is really desolating is that when you read the same chapter, 2 Chronicles 26, you realize that was not something which was expected, because Uzziah was a good king. If you read verse 4 and 5, it says there that he did what was right in the sight of the Lord according to all that his father Amaziah had done. He sought God in the days of Zechariah, who had understanding in the vision of God, and as long as he sought the Lord, God made him prosper. And he was indeed a king who was prosper. The Bible tells us that his reign was a reign of prosperity. He, I think, never reached that stage of prosperity since Solomon. So he was the second Solomon, Uzziah. He had built fortification. He strengthened the army. He had many victories according to the texts, the biblical texts. He fought against the Philistines and he won against them. He even built cities. The city of Eilat, in the south of Israel, you have Eilat, which is an harbor, to the Red Sea. He's the one who built that city, right? So he did things. He was very, and so this is why Isaiah, you can understand, so disappointed, so discouraged. You understand? Right? Therefore, he needs a new call. He needs God to recall him. All right. So then we go to Isaiah and Jotham. That's the next one, right? I told you that this is verse 1. We just follow the relationship between the kings. That's our program, our journey today, right? His relationship between the kings. So we had the first the relationship with the first king, Uzziah, dramatic, tragic. Right? And now we have with Jotham. The Bible is silent about it. It doesn't talk about so much about that relationship. Jotham is probably a regent for Uzziah when he became when Uzziah was became a leper, was leprous. Then the text suggests, and you read 2 Kings 15 verse 5, and the text I read also in Chronicles 2 Kings 15 verse 5 talks about Jotham, who has just taken over, when Uzziah had contracted leper. So the next one, then really the next king really with whom he had a relationship was the king Ahaz. Okay, Ahaz. The story of that first encounter between the king, Ahaz, and the prophet, Isaiah, is given in Isaiah 7. Right? We will not go into the details of Isaiah 7 because it's part of our plan to come and study this particular text later on. But what do we have here? Well, this is, by the way, this encounter between Isaiah and Ahaz is going to be told in chapter 7 and goes on until chapter 12 and chapter 13. Even in chapter 13 we are talking about, Assyria and the situation here between Isaiah and Ahaz. What is happening here? There is, we will not go into all the details, and you can look and read some literature about it. Just a little bit of give a little bit of in a nutshell what is happening, in kind of a digesting. We have the threat of Assyria. If you look at the board here, okay, could you come a little closer here? If you look at the board, I tried to draw something here. All right? You can see you have the Mediterranean Sea on your left with the little boat, which is going to help you. And then you have Israel in the north, Judah in the south, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon. This is more or less the map where we have. Assyria is becoming an important power now. We are in the 8th century BC, and Assyria is threatening. And we have, in the north of Israel, we have Syria, still today, right? We have Syria. And so when Syria, and we have also, of course, Israel. You remember that after Solomon, the God's people, the people of Israel, got divided. We had the north, which was called Israel, and the south, which was called Judah. Remember that story, okay? Now, Israel, the north, right, it feels threatened by this power of Assyria, which is coming up right now. And so what they want to do, Israel and Syria, they want to unite. There is a coalition against Assyria. But Ahaz, Judah, doesn't want to be a part of it. He doesn't want to join that coalition because they want him to be a part of that coalition. He doesn't want. He said, no, I don't want to be a part. I'm not interested. And so they are very upset. So what they want to do, and this is what chapter 7 is telling, they want to replace him by someone else. Okay, and then of course what he has in mind, he wants to have the help of Egypt, but he's not going to help, so he's scared to death. He doesn't know where he's going, he's afraid, and Isaiah comes and he tells him, don't be afraid, just trust, just have faith in the future, hope. You can have children and you will see the throne of David is still going, and he doesn't want. Ahaz doesn't want to bet on the future. Not children. No. Ask for a sign. You will see God. I don't want to give a sign. I will come back to that. We'll in the details of chapter 7 later on. But he doesn't want to have God, Isaiah the prophet says, right, I can give you a sign. I want to give you a sign. Oh, I refuse. I'm not interested in sign. This is what Ahaz says. He doesn't want to have children. Actually, you have the story of Ahaz. It's a very dramatic story. The story of Ahaz is associated with sacrifice of his son. In 2 Chronicles 28 verse 3, in 2 Kings 16 verse 3, 2 Kings 16 verse 3, we see Ahaz who is sacrificing later on his son. So he's someone who doesn't want the future to take place, right? And sacrifice of Moloch. So Ahaz doesn't want to run a risk, doesn't want to have the future, and this is where Isaiah says, well, you don't want to be involved in the future, you don't want to be a part of constructing the messianic seed, so the virgin will conceive. We don't need you. Right. We'll come back to that. It's a very interesting dialogue between Ahaz. Jewish tradition, by the way, associate that dialogue, that dramatic dialogue which Ahaz had, and with Isaiah, in the very place where he had sacrificed his son to Moloch. So there is making a kind of an interesting connection here. No future, no son. Is willing even to sacrifice. I don't want anything in the future. That's what characterized Ahaz. And then we have Isaiah and Hezekiah. This is in chapters 36, 37. We have also a threat there. The threat again of Assyria. And we have a personal threat. This is Hezekiah. The king Hezekiah is sick. He's going to die. So this is in connection to these two threats that Isaiah is, involved and intervenes. We have the story of Assyria, which is given in chapter 36, chapter 37, where we have the Assyria, who is the prince of Assyria, who comes and threatens Hezekiah. And then we have, of course, the story of Hezekiah, who is sick, who is about to die. It's given in chapter 38, and then his health is restored. There is a miracle, and he he recites a beautiful psalm, which is given here in Isaiah 38. Hezekiah, the king, seems to have been a poet, right? Be interested in literature, and we have records in the Bible where you see Hezekiah really interested in literature, playing the role of a collector, right? You have the story in Proverbs 25. He's the one who collected the Proverbs. You have the story in 2 Chronicles 29, verse 30. He's the one also who was interested in poetry, in literature. So this is what Hezekiah is. Anyway, Hezekiah is different than Ahaz. Ahaz, you remember, refused the sign. Hezekiah asks for a sign. So there is a contrast between the two kings, which is quite interesting, to which we will come back because it's kind of interesting. In chapter 39, when Hezekiah has recovered, of course everyone knows about it. So in chapter 39 we have the story of the king of Assyria who wants to congratulate him. He came and brought some gifts. That's the story. And then what did Hezekiah? So he shows off. Look what God has done for me. Right? Kind of a real testimony. Look what God has done for me. And then he fell in the trap. You know that story? And then in that particular story, we see Isaiah coming and also warning him again because he did something wrong. He forgot that he owed everything to God, that he was nothing. And in chapter 40, verse 6 to 8, we have a poem about vanity. It's interesting. A poem about vanity. All flesh is like grass. We have nothing. Okay. And then we conclude here. We have, this is the end of it, right? The end of the historical Isaiah, but yet we have something else. Isaiah and Manasseh. This is not recorded in the Bible, right? But we know that Isaiah died, of course. And Manasseh is just the one who came after Hezekiah. He was a bad guy. He was a bad king. He was very cruel, actually. And so in 2 Chronicles, chapter 1, 2 Kings 21, verse 16. 2 Kings 21, verse 16. We have the story of Manasseh. It says about him that he shed very much innocent blood. All he had filled Jerusalem from one end to another. Of course, it's kind of a exaggeration, perhaps, but to say the intensity of his cruelty. And in Jewish tradition, actually, they think that Manasseh was actually behind the murder of Isaiah. Isaiah was accused of being. Manasseh accused Isaiah being a false prophet. And the story tells us that Isaiah did not want to answer, and because he did not answer, so this silence was taken as an argument against him, and so he died as a martyr, and in a very dramatic manner, within this, like a sandwich in a trunk of a tree, and he was sewn there, and he died. So as you can see, Isaiah, that was not what you thought it was going to be, right? Was a prince. Everything seemed to be perfect for him. The nephew of a king, right? He started with a king who died as a leper, and he died himself sandwiched in the trunk of a tree as a martyr, right? This is important to remember that who was Isaiah, because this is someone who experienced hopelessness. He died as if God did not hear, right? To have this beautiful book and know that he died as a martyr in that way, it's troubling. Hopelessness. This is the story of Isaiah. And yet Isaiah, because he experienced hopelessness, he was really well qualified to speak about hope. because you cannot speak about hope unless you have experienced hopelessness. And this is what his name means. Yeshayahu, the Lord will save. But how can you really understand what salvation is all about if you are not aware that you are lost yourself? Okay, so that's this is preparing us here to the next step here, right? Tomorrow we will go to the next step, and that is understand the book. This is a man who had something to say. And if I may just conclude on that, Isaiah speaks about his lips, which were, unclean. And this is through these lips that we have that particular book. So tomorrow we will have some time to speak about the book of Isaiah. What is this book about? How it is written? How it is constructed? The beauty, the form. That's for tomorrow. Thank you.